All right, I hope you have your coffee. I hope you have your block note. Let's talk about peace. Let's talk about what is needed for peace, what can stop violence, and what can bring normalization. We're zooming in on the Abraham Accords today, who do just that. It's right after the Negev Summit. It's also right after Ukrainian and Russian officials came to Istanbul to negotiate the first steps towards peace. Our expert today is Avi Melamed. I'm super happy and excited to have him. Why? Because he just finished his book. He just finished his book tour in the US. He said, we called Sunday, he said it was very intense. And I personally would love some insights of the book as well. You can buy it yourself if you want to. Maybe he can tease us a little bit. The title is Inside the Middle East, Entering a New Era. Avi Melamed was born and raised in the city with a lot of symbols, Jerusalem. Symbols make narratives, but he's staying out of narratives and give you the reality. He served as he's a former Israeli intelligence official and senior official on Arab affairs. He served at the Salisbury Fellow of Intelligence and Middle East Affairs at the Eisenhower Institute. I think that's Washington, D.C. Mr. Melamed is the founder of Inside Middle East. So that's the title of the book again. In 2016, already wrote a book on that title, but now out in February, the newest one. That's an empowering educational program that provides apolitical education about the contemporary Middle East. As far as I'm concerned, Mr. Melamed doesn't have a lot of experience with Dutch crowds. Most of us are Dutch. So let's welcome him with some on-topic questions. You can put your questions in the comment section on Facebook or in the Q&A section on Zoom. Make sure you have some critical questions. I'm sure you will. And in the end of the presentation, we will try to answer most of the questions. Mr. Melamed, you once said somewhere that the essence of education is about how to think, not what to think. So I'm very curious and give the floor to you.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. Shalom from Israel. Good morning. Boker Tov. Shalom from Israel. I'm very pleased and honored to be here today with you. Accurately, as you said, I have less experience of working with a Dutch audience. So for me, it's a wonderful experience. And I hope that our encounter in this session will be well received and contributing for hopefully better understanding of the complex reality of the Middle East. Today, we are focusing on a specific issue, and this is the Abraham Accords. As a framing, I would say that shortly we will discuss and understand that the Abraham Accords is not something that happened overnight. It is something that has evolved and gradually developed during the last couple of years. And there are a couple of major factors that basically generate that process, and we'll understand together today what are those factors and why and how do they coincide right now. We'll also try together to assess the current and potentially ramifications and repercussions of the issue of the Abraham Accord. In my presentation today, we will explore, as I said, first the road to the Abraham Accord. We will then talk about the concept of normalization. In Arabic, it's tatbi'. In the Arab public discourse, it of course refers to the whole question of like, should there be a relationship of the Arab world with Israel? And if so, in what terms? Or shouldn't there be any kind of relationship with the state of Israel? And obviously, this is a major issue that also relates to the story of the Abraham Accord. And finally, we'll try to assess together the regional reactions to the Abraham Accords by the different regional players. So, as we are talking about the road leading to the Abraham Accords, I would say we could identify a couple of milestones leading to that point of time. One is the acceptance of Israel's existence. The second thing is the changing strategic priorities of the Arab world. And the third thing, which goes hand in hand with the two other factors that I mentioned right now, and shortly we will see how, is the fact that Palestinian cause plummets on the political agenda of major Arab leaders and major Arab players in the region. Let us start with the acceptance of Israel's existence. You know, the Israeli-Arab conflict, or rather also known as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, at least until the mid of the 20th century, a little bit afterwards, was basically kind of like a consensus in the Arab world that there should be no reconciliation with Israel, no peace agreement, Israel has to be eradicated, and so on and so on. We have witnessed a couple of military rounds between Israel and major Arab states during that time. But actually, there has been an evolving process that basically led into growing realization among major Arab players in the region that the whole idea of like ending the conflict by erasing the state of Israel, militarily speaking, is not going to happen. And in fact, 1973 war was actually the milestone in the sense that following that war, that was the point where basically we have witnessed a very rapid process that led towards the late 70s to the milestone, the historic milestone, where the most significant Arab state, the state that actually was leading for a long period of time the battle against Israel, Egypt, signed a peace agreement with Israel. That was a very significant milestone, obviously, because it basically marked up the understanding that Israel is becoming fait accompli and an existing fact in the Middle East. And moreover, the major Arab states, Egypt, signing peace agreement with Israel, obviously was a step that was enormously dramatic in the geostrategic landscape of the region. It basically led later on in a gradual process that other things were involved in. That was not the only thing, but other things also were involved in, to the signing of what is known as the Oslo Accords in the mid-90s, in 1993, between Israel and the PLO, basically setting sort of like time frame and general frame for a potential Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation and the establishing of what has become to be known as the Palestinian National Authority or the Palestinian Authority. That was also yet another milestone in the graduate process of growing understanding that Israel is integral part of the region, and it has to be, therefore, in the end of the day, its existence has to be acknowledged and accepted. And indeed, a year later, after 1993, 1994, Israel and Jordan are signing the second Israeli-Arab peace agreement, the Arava Valley agreement signed between Israel and Jordan, 1994, yet another point where basically the idea of accepting Israel as an existing fact in the region is more and more percolating and being internalized in the region. So that was one process that was gradually involved and leading to the point of the Abraham Accord. The other thing was and is an interesting conjunction of both major domestic challenges within Arab world, as well as major growing regional threats that basically resulted in the end of the day, change of priorities, of agenda and geostrategic interest of major Arab players. And shortly we'll see that some of them, not by chance, are major players that are also involved in the story of the Abraham Accord. So let's look first at the aspect of the domestic challenges. One major challenge is the growing and increasing turbulences across the Arab world. These are basically turbulences that are going back to the whole story of the failure of the national statehood, the concept of national statehood in the Arab world in the 20th century. Roughly speaking, generally speaking, when you look at the whole story of national statehood, a concept that was introduced to the people of the Middle East in the 20th century, when you look at this story, it's to a large extent the story of failure. The divided regionally, tribally, ethnically, religiously, culturally, groups of the people in the Middle East, basically were unable to create a sort of like a consensus, a solid consensus that is very much required if you want to build a solid platform upon which a functioning modern state can operate. In fact, it's very clear that when you look at the history of most of the countries in the Middle East, Lebanon and Syria, Iraq, Tunisia and others, you see time and again that the separatist identities, the ones that are characterized by the religious identity, cultural identity, ethnical identity, geographical identity, those separatist features were much more stronger in comparison to the concept of national statehood. So in the end of the day, it resulted in a politics that is very sectarian politics. And basically, instead of like seeking to create a wide as possible common consensus and platform that could enable the people and the state to basically evolve and develop, what we have witnessed was the evolving of a sectarianist political systems across the region, the one that basically always preferred a very domestic, narrow political strategic interest over the common cause of the well-being, of the good of the all people. And the outcome of that was basically, roughly speaking, when you look at the history of the countries in the Middle East, it's not surprising that time and time again, it's characterized by the rise to power of brutal dictators and brutal dictatorships that are basically mostly engaged in securing their own narrow sectarian political interest, and that comes at the expense of the needs and services of the people of the region. The meaning of that was that in course of time, what we have witnessed was, on the one hand, a very corrupted, oppressive political system, and on the other hand, a deepening challenges, grievance of the people as their needs are unaddressed or very partially addressed by the governments and the rulers. And that basically resulted in a growing process of growing discontent, anger, and frustration that was from time to time burst in different kind of like demonstrations, riots, and outcry, until this massively smoking volcano erupted about a decade ago, when a young Tunisian peddler, Mohammed Boulazizi, basically frustrated with the lack of future, lack of hope. He was working as a peddler, selling fruits and vegetables on the street of Tunisia, and to provide his family. He was fined because he didn't have a license. So frustrated, he set himself on fire, and basically he did not outlast that. He died, but by doing the terrible thing, he basically set a fire across the region, across the Middle East, rather than going to be known by the name of the Arab Spring. And the Arab Spring, in essence, is the point of time where dozens and dozens of millions of people across the Middle East in Arab countries, from Morocco, sweeping through North Africa, Tunisia and Algeria and Libya, Egypt, into the Levant, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, down to the Gulf, to the area of Kuwait, and other millions are going out to the streets and demanding their governments and rulers to provide them with real answers to the real challenges, educational systems and employment opportunities and running water and electricity and safety and security and all those little things, quote unquote, that life is made of. So this is the story of the Arab Spring. And ever since we have witnessed these major turbulences that are rocking and shaking the Middle East and particularly the Arab countries to their core. And basically, this is a very significant process that is going to continue, because it's not going to be something that, of course, going to be solved overnight. So this is one major issue when we are talking about domestic challenges. Another major issue is the need of governments and rulers in the region, in the end of the day, to adjust their people, themselves, to the rapidly technologically based and changed 21st century reality. The issue is that not only the countries that are already struggling economically, but also countries that basically have a lot of wealth, like Iraq or the Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates and others, are also basically struggling exactly with the same challenges, because in the end of the day, the need is to be able to address the challenges of the 21st century and not the challenges of the 20th century. And in order to be able to do that successfully, the key word here is basically technology, and most significantly, the understanding how to apply technological advanced systems, either in terms of like energy security, food security, medical services, education, and other aspects of life, security, intelligence, and on, how to apply those systems in an efficient and productive and fruitful way in the modern 21st one national statehood across the Middle East. In other words, the major challenge is not only to identify the fields or the arenas where you need to apply those solutions. The major challenge is not the ability to acquire or to purchase or to get those technological capacities. Those countries obviously have the ability to have those capacities. They have the funds and finance and structure needed to buy those capacities, technological solutions and stuff like that. That's not the issue. The issue is to have the ability to apply those advanced technological systems on a national level scale. This is the major issue here. It's not about buying the software or the hardware. It's about buying the knowledge that already has been accumulated in order to apply those advanced systems in the most efficient way into the national-based social and economical system. And this is something very significant, and shortly we'll see how it's significant in the context of the Abraham Accords. So on top of those domestic challenges that countries in the Middle East are facing in different levels of intensity, of course, but they are all facing that, we also face a major regional threats. And particularly, there are three major sources of threats or increasing instability in the region. One is Iran, the other one is Turkey, and the third one is the threat presented by militant Islam groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and others. Let's say a few words about the threat presented by the Mullah regime in Tehran. The Mullah regime in Tehran that came to power in 1979, the Islamic Revolution, is ideologically very radical, extreme regime, motivated by some of the deepest narratives of the Shiites, and one of the most significant one is the one that actually seeking to have the leadership crown of the Muslim world. Motivated by those narratives and by an outlook of revolutionary outlook of the world, and inspired by visions of crowning Shiites as the leader of the Muslim world, as well as crowning Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, as the regional leading superpower. The Mullah regime has been leading in the last generation, and particularly in the last 2 decades, a very aggressive expansion policy throughout the Middle East under the title of exporting the Islamic Revolution. The purpose of exporting Islamic Revolution in the eyes of the Mullah regime is dual. One is to position Iran as the regional superpower, and the other one is actually, in the eyes of the Mullah regime, by positioning the Islamic Republic of Iran as the major superpower in the Middle East. That will be, in their mind, the ultimate triumph of Shiites over their close rivalries, the Sunni Muslims, a rivalry that has been going on in Islam for centuries. And indeed, taking advantage of the very unstable situation in Arab state, taking advantage of the failure of the concept of national statehood in most of the Arab states, taking advantage of the fact that sectarianism basically torn apart Arab societies from within, the mullah regime was basically able to create a network of proxies across the Middle East in Arab states. Most of the cases, those proxies are based upon local domestic Shiite population. That was the case in Lebanon, for example, when the mullah regime established in the beginning of the 80s what is going to become its most powerful proxy in the region, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is based upon mostly Lebanese Shiite. In Syria, the mullah regime has allied with the Alawite rule of Assad. Assad is a part of the Alawite minority in Syria. The Alawites are considered to be distant branch of the Shiites in Iraq, taking advantage of the rise of ISIS and the growing instability in Iraq. The mullah regime was basically able to create a sort of like Iraqi-based Shiite proxies in the frame or the shape of militias that are actually funded by the Iraqi government and armed by the Iraqi government, but practically they are following the Iranians' order. In Yemen, in 2014, a Yemenite Shiite-based group, congregation of tribes called Houthis, launched a coup, a military coup, ousting the Yemenite government. That coup evolved into a war that continues up until today in Yemen, between the Houthis on the one hand and the ousted Yemenite government who flee to Aden in South Yemen, and the government is backed by the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates. Yemen became a stage for actually an Iranian Saudi standoff or clashes or collision. And finally, if you look at the map, you could see the yellow symbol, which stands for a place called the Gaza Strip. One of the major cards the mullah regime plays very skillfully and successfully in order to advance its vision was the story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The mullah regime positioned itself as the defender of the Palestinians in the conflict. The mullah regime echoed slogans like liberating Al-Quds, Jerusalem, liberating Palestine. That tactic was very effective, chosen and wisely chosen by the mullah regime, because they knew that by doing that, they actually bypassed the resentment and natural suspicions of many people in the Arab world who, remind you, are predominantly Sunnis. And basically by echoing those slogans that are very popular in the Arab public realm, the mullah regime was basically able to kind of like bypass the resentment and suspicions of the Sunnis in the Arab world. And as a fact, today, in the last decade, following the fact that the mullah regime has deepened its influence and power within Arab states, doing that violently in most of the cases, the picture has changed, and many people in the Arab world are actually saying today, we have noticed and we have realized that we have been schemed, we have been manipulated cynically by the mullah regime with this whole concept of like defending allegedly the Palestinians and so on. So the yellow symbol that you see in the map in front of you in Gaza Strip basically represents the two major Palestinian military powers in Gaza Strip, Hamas, who controls Gaza Strip since 2007, and the second largest military power in Gaza Strip, which is Islamic Jihad in Palestine. Both Hamas and Islamic Jihad are Sunnis, not Shiites. However, they are also part of this Iranian crescent, since they all basically are sharing the same concept of vowing the same concept of eliminating the state of Israel through the use of power. However, in course of time, and as the mullah regime basically says to the Arab world in their face, the mullah regime says to the Arabs, the mullah regime, we control Arab countries, we control Lebanon, which is correct. Lebanon is to a large extent an Iranian satellite. Lebanon is kind of like a fiction. It has a government and president and parties and parliament and military power, but the real boss in Lebanon is Hezbollah. And in other words, the real boss in Lebanon is the Iranians. Syria is partly occupied by the Iranians, either the presence of Islamic Revolutionary Guards forces in Syria, and also Iranian-backed Shiite proxies like Afghan or Pakistani or the Hezbollah forces in operating in Syria. In Iraq, as I mentioned before, there are those Iraqi-based Shiite militias backed by the Iranians and basically serving the Iranians. Yemen, I referred to that earlier. The Houthis are massively backed by the Iranians. So the mullah regime says to the Arab world, we control 4 Arab countries in your face. And in addition to that, we have to notice that in course of time, and particularly in the last decade, the aggression of the mullah regime was particularly increasing also in the area of the Gulf. The Persian or the Arab Gulf, depend who defines that, and also the area of the Bab el-Mandab Strait, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Arab Ocean. All those areas became an arenas of a growing and deepening Iranian aggression. And reminding you, in the last couple of years, we have witnessed a direct Iranian military attacks on Saudi Arabia, and also attacks conducted by Iranian militias, particularly Houthis, attacking Saudi Arabia, oil facilities and infrastructure, cities and airports, attacking the United Arab Emirates, attacking the maritime ships in the area of the Gulf, both in the Red Sea as well as in the Hormuz Strait, the Arab-Persian Gulf. In other words, in the last couple of years, we have witnessed this growing, boosting Iranian aggression, not only in the area of the Levant, in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, but also in the area of the Gulf, and obviously creating a growing challenge to the Gulf, the Arab Gulf monarchies, and a growing and deepening concern. Parallel to the growing Iranian threat in the region, presence and influence, Turkey, under the leadership of Erdogan, also took advantage of the very shaky situation of Arab countries. And again, also similar to the Iranians, Turkey played the Palestinian card to basically gain advantage in the region. And actually, Erdogan, motivated by an inspiration or aspiration to become the leader of the Sunni camp in the Middle East, Erdogan also took advantage of the weakness and instability in a couple of Arab countries, like, for example, Libya, Syria, Iraq, to actually create itself strongholds, bases, military presence in those areas. And indeed, when you look at this map, and you could see the way that Turkey has expanded and scattered its influence and presence across the Middle East, you could notice Central Africa, Northern Africa, Western Africa, the Levant area, the Gulf area. Turkey has a military base in Qatar. Turkey has a military base in Somalia, right next to the Horn of Africa, next to the Bab el-Mandab Strait.
If I may interrupt here for 1 second, what do you mean if you say the Palestinian card?
I will refer to that shortly. I will elaborate on that. But as I said before, when I was talking about the Iranian, and I was talking about the fact that one of the major, at least up until recently, one of the major ways that the Iranians were very skillfully playing was the concept of, like, we, the Iranians, we will free Palestine and we will defend the Palestinians. Turkey is doing occasionally the same use of that card. In other words, Erdogan positioned itself to be, the sponsor of Hamas and supporter of the people of Gaza Strip. In many occasions, the story of Gaza Strip and the tension between Gaza Strip under Hamas and Israel, on the other hand, has been played out by Erdogan as a way to harvest political dividends and popularity in the region. So, the story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and particularly the story of Gaza Strip, became a very useful card that both Turkey and Iran plays at will. And again, both Turkey and Iran plays this card because they know that since the story of the Palestinian is very central in the Arab public realm, Turkey and Iran knows that by positioning themselves as the defenders of the Palestinians, the saviors of Gaza and stuff like that, they kind of like harvest political dividends in the Arab world. They basically can, by doing that, they are bypassing resentments and suspicious in the Arab world. And indeed, as far as Turkey and Iran are concerned, to a large extent, using that pawn of the Palestinian, the story of Gaza, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, using that pawn was to a large extent quite effective in the service of both Iran and Turkey hegemonic vision. However, as I mentioned before, and we'll touch on that later on, there has been some change in that sense in the last decade. We'll talk about that change shortly when we'll talk about some other aspect that has to do with the Abraham Accord. So going back to Turkey and Erdogan's aspiration to become the leader of the Sunni camp in the Middle East, that aspiration basically confront major Sunni players in the Middle East who are Arabs, reminding you, Turkey is not an Arab state. But however, Turkey is predominantly Sunni, and Turkey ruled the Middle East for centuries, the Turkish Ottoman Empire. However, a majority of the Arabs in the Middle East have bad memories from the time of the rule of the Turkish Ottoman empires. And obviously today in the 21st century, the Arab has no desire to be again under the wing of Turkey, and obviously not to be under the leadership of Erdogan. And so you could understand that Erdogan's aspiration to become the leader of the Sunni camp in the Middle East, by the way, he also envisioned himself to be on a global level Sunni leader. Erdogan is coming from the womb of the Sunni Muslim Brotherhood mindset. Obviously, that aspiration collides with the major Arab Sunni players in the region, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the major leaders of the Arab world, United Arab Emirates, who on the one hand acknowledges Turkey's role and accepts Turkey's significance, but on the other hand rejects Turkey's, Erdogan's aspiration to be the leader of the Sunni camp in the region. So all in all, when you look at the both Iranian as well as the Turkish challenge presented to the region, and particularly at the expense of the Arab world, that map obviously illustrates the nature of the challenges, and you could see very clearly both the yellow as well as the red flags representing both Iran and Turkey, and you could see very easily how both Iran and Turkey are taking advantage of the instability across the region, particularly taking advantage of the crumbling statehood across the Middle East of the Arab states to basically deepen and increase their influence presence in different Arab countries. So all in all, when you look at the outcome, the cumulative outcome of those challenges, the hegemonic visions of mostly, particularly Iran, and to a lesser extent, Erdogan. Today, we could notice like 5 major arenas of tension in the region, in the Middle East. One is the eastern basin of the Mediterranean. You could see it circled in the upper part of the map. The eastern basin of the Mediterranean is enormously significant arena. It contains large amount of natural gas. It is the connection point between the Red Sea and down towards Southeast Asia on the one hand and Europe on the other hand. Then we see the Red Sea itself, which is an enormously significant passage, a maritime route that connects the Mediterranean into the Indian Ocean. In the bottom part of the map, you could see this big circle circling the Bab el-Mandab Strait, actually the meeting point between Asia and Africa, right next to the Horn of Africa. This is one of the most strategic location on earth, this narrow bottleneck through which major maritime trade, oil, crude oil and others ships are crossing through. Another maritime arena is the Gulf, the Hormuz Gulf, that you could see right, the Hormuz Strait that you could see right in front of you beneath Iran, also circled in this circle, the Persian or the Arab Strait, the Gulf as it's called. So these are 4 major arenas of enormously maritime arenas in the region that of enormously geostrategic importance. And then colored in green, you could see what is entitled under the Iran land corridor. This is the attempt of Iran to create a land corridor that is solely, strictly controlled directly by Iran, crossing through Iraq, Syria and ending in Lebanon, offshore the eastern basin of the Mediterranean Sea, to a large extent, part of that corridor exists. In Lebanon, for example, Iran actually controls that land corridor. Hezbollah, who controls the gateways to Iran, to Lebanon, actually enables Iran a direct land control also over Lebanon, in addition to the aerial one. In Syria, it's partially controlled by the Iranian. In Iraq, it's yet not. But just the same, this is another major significant arena of this growing tension. So when you look at these 5 arenas, the 4 maritime arenas, namely the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandab Strait, and the Arab Gulf, together with the land arena of the land corridor, the Iranian attempt to create this land corridor, we are looking at a region that is experiencing an enormous tension, enormous challenges and frictions. And you could easily see that the whole area of the Gulf is one of the major focal arenas of those tensions resulted or generated or stemmed from particularly the Iranian aggression. So this combination, what I was describing right now, the Iranian and Turkish hegemonic vision, the creation of those arenas of tension across the region, basically are what underlines the formation of what I call the alliance of moderation, hence leading to the point of the road to the Abraham Accords. When you look at the flags in front of you, you could notice that, of course, the flag of Israel, and all surrounded by Arab countries. We got Egypt and Jordan, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Morocco, Bahrain. That alliance of moderation, as I call it, is actually reflecting the point of time where, given those enormous challenges that I was describing, both domestically as well as regionally, given to the threats, and particularly the Iranian threat presented to the region, and particularly to Israel on the one hand, as well as to the Arab Gulf monarchies on the other hand, those are basically geostrategic features of this restructured geostrategical landscape of the Middle East that actually are underlying or are beneath the formation of this alliance of moderation that actually centers around, roughly speaking, the concept of the need to have a stability. The 2 major aspects that alliance is basically supposed to address or try to address is, one, to intercept or thwart or to push back the Iranian challenge, the Iranian threat, particularly the Iranian threat, to a lesser extent Turkey, which presents less of a challenge in comparison to the Iranian challenge. And the other thing is, going back to what I say when I was talking about the domestic challenges of many Arab countries, and among them the need to adjust themselves to the 21st century and to be able to apply a national scale advanced technological capacities that are actually very much critical for the evolving or developing of a new income revenues of more functioning, positively sort of speaking, institutions on a national level, scale level. Those 2 major issues basically bring those players together, where the players can offer each other something that serves their long strategic interest. And in that sense, one of the most significant aspects of the Abraham Accords is basically the fact that it reflects not only the process that I was talking before when I was talking about the willingness to accept Israel in the region. We talked about it when we talked about it in the context of Israeli-Jordanian peace agreement and Israel-Egypt peace agreement. But more than that, the Abraham Accords now is looking at, or is an expression of an outlook looking at Israel by major Arab players, not only as a state that is legitimately in the region and has to be accepted as such, but also as a valuable strategic partner. And this is a very significant jump, sort of speaking, in comparison, for example, to the peace treaty with Egypt and the peace treaty with Jordan. And so the Abraham Accord, in that sense, actually leads or takes this whole issue to a new level, a new scale, and accordingly also the discussion that comes along with it. Now, we have to be clear, and when we talk about the story of the Alliance of Moderation, that actually is what's underlying the story of the Abraham Accord, it does not reflect change of hearts, of ideologies. The major Arab states that are part of that process are not becoming Zionist. They don't share the Zionist vision, but it's about a cold, very well calculated long-term strategic interest of those states. So, for example, we can easily understand that the United Arab Emirates, the Saudis, even though in the backstage, have a lot of interest to cooperate with Israel, for example, because they are directly and indirectly attacked by the Iranians. And so for them, Israel, who is also coming under a major Iranian threat, for them, partnering with Israel is enormously strategically needed. Same is for Israel, vice versa. Israel needs this cooperation with the Saudis, with the United Arab Emirates, is also part of Israel's need to effectively intercept and confront the growing Iranian challenge. There is another major aspect of that brings those players together to the table. Just mentioned earlier, we talked about the Negev Summit. One of the issues that came up in the Negev Summit was the issue of fighting terror, an issue that bothers those countries. I mean, Egypt is engaged in an ongoing struggle against ISIS and other militant Islamist groups that are scattered in Egypt, Sinai Peninsula, presenting Egypt a very significant challenge. We have to remember that the leading Sunni militant Islamist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and others are actually presenting a very serious threat to the regimes and governments in the Arab world, because they view those governments and regimes as illegitimate, because according to their outlook, meaning Al-Qaeda, ISIS and such, those are not legitimate governments because they are not really Muslims. They are kind of like fake Muslims. Obviously, needless to say that militant Islamist groups are also presenting challenge to Israel. We just have in the last couple of days attacks, terror attacks in Israel. Some of them are basically, one of them was ISIS claimed responsibility, and it's very clear that many of those attacks are inspired by militant Islamic ideology. So once again, we see another aspect that brings those players together to the table, again, not from a place of hugging and kissing, but from a place of like a joint long-term strategic interest. They are all related in the end of the day to the issue of the need for stability. If you look at state like Sudan, which is a member or partner to the Abraham Accord, Sudan signed a normalization agreement with Israel. We just think about the fact that in 1967, Sudan hosted the famous Khartoum summit that actually was known for its triple no. This is in Sudan, where in 1967, the Arab world said loudly, no reconciliation, no peace, no negotiation with Israel. Sudan, a couple of years ago, has been one of the major launching base from which Iranian shipments of weapons made their way towards Gaza Strip. There has been reports that in the past, not so far, long time ago, Israel was attacking in Sudan those shipments of weapons. So all of a sudden, now you see Sudan in kind of like a very drastic and dramatic shift of heart, sort of speaking, or changing its skin, and becomes part of the Alliance of Moderation and part of the Abraham Accords and normalization with Israel. The Sudanese did not become all of a sudden Zionist. The major reason for that is that Sudan, struggling in enormous economic challenges, Sudan needed those agreements because one of the things that it ensured the Sudanese was support of the American administration. It also ensured the Sudanese that Arab Gulf monarchies will pitch in and also support the crumbling Sudanese economy. It comes with a price tag. So, for example, Sudan was expected, and indeed it did so, to limit the influence or attempts of Turkey to deepen its presence in Sudan. Sudan is expected to be part of the Arab Gulf monarchies and along the long Red Sea shoreline of the countries that are basically gathering together to fight both the growing challenge presented by Iran and Houthis in Yemen, as well as the growing challenge of maritime piracy. So this is yet another example of the strategic needs, sort of speaking, of players that are involved in the Abraham Accords. When you look at Morocco, for example, one of the major things is that Morocco is also suffering the Iranian influence in the context of the story of the Western Polisario. Morocco has long time been asking for the American administration to acknowledge the Moroccan claims over the Western Sahara, which basically indeed happened as part of the Abraham Accords, meaning it is in return for participating in that, the Trump administration formally acknowledged Morocco claims on that topic. Morocco struggles have a long and bitter dispute with its giant neighbor to the east, Algeria. This is another yet a reason for the Moroccans to seek for alliances, regional alliances. So all in all, when you look at the needs of those players, the calculated, cold, quote unquote, needs, you basically can see very clearly how they have a joint interest in coming together and forming such an alliance. And indeed, when you look at the map of the region, once again, going back to what we saw before when we talked about the arenas of tensions and conflicts in the region, you could see very clearly how the same arenas you could find in circles the alliance or members of the alliance coming together in order to secure their strategic interest in those arenas, in the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, to block the Turkish attempt to become the boss, sort of speaking, in the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, and the one that could interrupt or control or threat the flow of natural gas, for example, is one major interest of Israel, Egypt, and other states that are interested in that. In the Red Sea, the free flow of trade, oil, crude oil, tankers, ships, is also another major interest of those countries, the countries of the alliance, pushing back, thwarting the Iranian attempt to create this land corridor stretching from Iraq to Syria and Lebanon is another interest. And of course, the whole area of Bab el-Mandab Strait and the Arab/Persian Gulf, yet another major area of interest of those members of the alliance. For example, in the context of the story of the war in Yemen, a maybe less known episode, but very significant one that illustrates very well what I said right now. The archipelago of Socotra, which is part of Yemen, but it's located it's a group of islands, a couple of hundreds miles away from Yemen, but formally part of Yemen. There has been an ongoing battle, sort of speaking, of influence over those group of islands, which are enormously significant. You could see them on the right-hand side of the map, circled. You could see the flag of Israel, and you may wonder what Israel has to do with this area. Well, this remote area is indeed very significant for Israel as well, as it controls the passage from the Indian Ocean towards the Bab el-Mandab Strait. And indeed, there has been a cooperation reportedly between Israel and the United Arab Emirates to secure control over this group of islands and to block both Iranian as well as Turkish attempt to take control over those specific islands because of their strategic location. So this is one example of the very concrete strategic and geostrategic needs of the members of the alliance across the region. Now, there is another interesting aspect of the story of the Abraham Accord, and this is, as I mentioned before, that the Palestinian cause plummets on the Arab political agenda. Now, in that sense, I have to make it clear. In the Arab public realm, the story of the Palestinian cause and the whole issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a very present issue. It's there, it's in the discussion, in the cultural and the political discussion, in the social media, and so on and so on. However, when you look at the political agenda and priorities of the major Arab players, you could notice very clearly the shift, the change that took place. The Palestinian cause has been significantly downgraded in the priorities list and political agenda of the major Arab players. There are different reasons for that process. Naming few, there is a growing discontent in the Arab world with the Palestinians. That discontent is fueled, for example, by the fact that in the Arab world there is a growing notion that the Palestinians actually are not really looking for reconciling and to end the conflict, because the Palestinians are not willing to pay the price that comes involved in such an agreement. And then, of course, there is the story of the inner Palestinian split between Hamas and Islamic and Palestinian Authority, between Hamas and Fatah, and all the attempts of major Arab leaders, the Saudis, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, to reconcile the Palestinians. All those attempts basically failed. I mean, the agreements that were signed formally were thrown to the garbage can by the Palestinians the next day. And then, of course, there is another significant thing that also fueled this discontent and anger and frustration and criticism in Arab world is the story of Gaza Strip, and particularly the siding of Hamas and Islamic Jihad with Iran. The same Iran that presents such a serious threat to major Arab states, Iran that brags and says to the Arab world in their face, we control 4 Arab countries, Iran that is responsible for the catastrophe in Syria, in Lebanon. The Arab world is furious with the fact that Palestinian factors like Hamas and Islamic Jihad are basically siding with the Iranians, and to a lesser extent with Turkey as well. So all these things together fuel this growing discontent and anger within the Arab world, and that resulted in, among other things, to the fact that the Palestinian case, the Palestinian cause plummets on the political agenda and political priorities of the Arab world. In fact, when you look in some recent milestones in that context, like, for example, the moving of the embassy from the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, or the Trump peace initiative, Peace for Prosperity. Formally, the Arab world obviously expressed rejection of those things, but practically speaking, the Arab world sent a very clear message to the Palestinian and actually says, look, times have changed, circumstances are changed. You Palestinian, you should come forward and try to find more creative way and effective and constructive ways to dialogue with this new reality. Otherwise, you are going to be left behind while that ship is already has sailed away. And the message that comes across from the Arab world to the Palestinian is very clear. It says, we, the Arab world, we have sacrificed a lot for your cause. We have sacrificed a lot for you. We have today totally different reality, different priorities, different challenges. We are much more consumed with our own inner challenges and issues. You Palestinians, you have to find your path. You have to make a decision, where do you want to go? And the Arab world basically saying to the Palestinian, whatever you decide, that's fine. It's your decision. We will back you. But the subtext of the message coming from the Arab world to the Palestinian is, if you will decide to continue the path of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, don't expect us, the Arabs, to be supportive of that. If you will decide to take the path of constructive negotiations and reconciliation with Israel, we, the Arab, we will support it. Again, going back to the Negev Summit, the same notion was clearly expressed. The former Arab speakers basically said, we support the concept of two-state solution. We support the Palestinian demand for a capital in East Jerusalem. It's very clear that the message that comes across from the Arab world actually says to the Palestinian, you Palestinians, it's your time to make your own inner decision, because we, Arab world, we are engaged in our own huge inner challenges. And that brings me to say a few words about the concept of normalization. In Arabic, it's called tadbir in the Arab public discourse. The term itself in Arabic is interesting because it could be translated in two totally different opposing ways. One is a positive in the context of like making things normal, normalization, tadbir. The other, which is kind of like opposite, is basically meaning to do something artificially, which of course has a negative context. And the story of tadbir, normalization, in the context of relationship with Israel has been always very much present in the discussion in the Arab world. And in that sense, you could identify three major camps involved in that discussion in the Arab world. One camp is the camp that totally rejects normalization. Not surprisingly, a major chunk of this camp is coming from the world of Islamic thought. Many Islamist theologists reject the concept of an independent state of Israel and state, of course, of the Jewish people. They justified it in a theological justification, of course, their own theological justification, basically saying that though Islam recognized Judaism as a monotheistic religion, Islam argued that Jews have betrayed their divine mission and Allah punished the Jews by scattering them in the world and never to have their own independent entity. So at the eyes of those Islamic theologists, the existence of a Jewish state is totally unacceptable because it's, in their eyes, it's defiance of the divine master plan of Allah to the world, and therefore it cannot be accepted. So this is one camp that actually totally rejects the idea of normalization. The Muslim Brotherhood, or at least the dogmatic part of the Muslim Brotherhood, is one example. Obviously, needless to say, militant Islamist groups that are coming from the hub of Salafi jihadi thought also, of course, adopt the same outlook. Second camp is interesting because this is a camp that, on the one hand, actually express willingness to have normalization with Israel, but it is a conditional one. And when you look at the condition, the practically meaning of that willingness is that it's actually not different from the first camp. Why? Because that camp, the second camp, actually says, yes, we are willing to accept Israel's existence. We are willing to have normalization with Israel, but in conditions that the Israeli-Palestinian will be solved, and it will be solved in a way that all the demands of the Palestinians are fully met one-to-one. This is the troubling part, because one of the major demands of the Palestinian is what the Palestinians call Hakr al-Awda, the right of return. The Palestinians argue that Palestinian refugees and their descendants, the Palestinians argue that it's about 4 million people or so, will be entitled as part of a peace agreement with Israel to go and to settle down in Israel and to claim back properties and to claim back compensation and so on and so on. As far as the Israelis are concerned, and overwhelmingly Israeli Jews, with exception of very, very, small minorities within the Israeli Jews, but overwhelmingly most of the Israeli Jews says this is totally non-acceptable. It's a non-starter, it's non-negotiable, because the meaning of that is that will basically bring the end of the state of Israel. And so, in other words, the camp that says the Arab camp that says we are willing to have normalization, but in conditions that all the Palestinians' needs are going to be met one-to-one, the practical meaning of that is that actually this camp also, in the end of the day, is not much different from the first camp. They are not, in the end of the day, they are not really willing to accept the existence of the state of Israel, and therefore the issue of normalization is less relevant in that context. The Abraham Accord actually brings to life the third camp that come from an interesting different perspective, and that camp actually echoed very clearly by the United Arab Emirates and others, actually says The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a conflict that has to be solved. It is not necessarily something that has to be automatically related to the issue of normalization with Israel. In other words, United Arab Emirates, for example, they are very clearly saying, we support the Palestinians, or most of the Palestinians' demands. We identify with the Palestinians. At the same time, we, the United Arab Emirates, we identify the peace agreement with Israel as in our own strategic interest. And therefore, we don't see any contradiction between the things, and we are moving on both paths in parallel. And this is a very significant argument, because it's an argument that up until relatively recently was not so much present in the Arab public realm. Now, the United Arab Emirates, and not only them, the Moroccans, the Bahrainians, and others are coming and saying, look, don't mix between the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the one hand, and between the legitimate needs and interests of our governments, of Morocco, of Bahrain, of Sudan, of United Arab Emirates. And moreover, the United Arab Emirates echoed a very interesting sentiment, basically saying to the Palestinians, look, by signing peace agreement with Israel, not only we are not betraying you, as you, the Palestinians, claimed, but we are serving you, the Palestinians. Why and how do you serve the Palestinians by signing a peace agreement with Israel? Well, the United Arab Emirates answer is that by signing a peace agreement with Israel, that is actually further support the pragmatic, moderate voice within the Palestinian camp, and that could result in an inner Palestinian process trajectory that could help the Palestinians to come to the place where they will be really willing and able to sign a deal, to make compromises that are needed in order to be able to sign a deal. So this third camp that actually says normalization is unconditional, that camp that comes along together with the story of the Abraham Accord brings this new aspect, these new arguments into the discussion, into the general discussion of normalization in the Arab public sphere. In that context, I must notice something interesting. There are some circles within mostly democratic slash liberal slash progressive camp in the West. There are some circles among that camp that oppose the Abraham Accords, that reject the Abraham Accord. They argue that the Abraham Accord is illegitimate because it's an agreement signed between brutal governments, oppressive governments like the Arab governments involved, and on the one hand, and a state that is an occupying Palestinian land, obviously the state of Israel. That argument has not skipped the eyes of the people in the region, those who support the Abraham Accords. And their answer is very interesting, because the answer basically says, to counter that argument, the answer says, the attempt to actually judge a legitimate sovereign government decision regarding its own political interest or strategic interest, in other words, United Arab Emirates or Sudan or Morocco or Bahrain, the attempt of Western circles to judge that morally should be totally rejected, because it's a condescending attempt. It's a condescending approach that actually defies our sovereign, independent, free decision. We, the United Arab Emirates, we, as the sovereign, as the government that's responsible for we have made the decision that that is the right thing that serves us. We, the Moroccans, make the decision that this is the best thing that serves us. So if anyone comes to disqualify or criticize our legitimate decision as a sovereign to do what we think is the best for ourselves and our people, if somebody is trying to come and delegitimize that based upon a moral judgment, this is totally unacceptable and should be rejected and refused overall. So this is an interesting counter argument that is made, and I think it's important it's important to bring that argument. Also, the other argument that is made by those circles who oppose the agreement in the West is that they are arguing that the agreement is actually betraying or throwing the Palestinians under the bus. And again, at this point, I refer to what I said before about what the Emirates are actually saying to the Palestinians. Not only that we are not betraying you, are actually, by signing this agreement, we are helping the moderate, pragmatic Palestinian camp to gain momentum and to play a more significant and constructive role in the inner Palestinian politics. So these are kind of like a side note that I wanted to share with you regarding the issue of normalization. Now, when you look at the reactions of the different players in the region to the Abraham Accords, well, it was very clearly understood that, players like Iran, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Algeria, they expressed rejection to the whole story of the Abraham Accord. Obviously, we can understand when we talk about Iran or Turkey, we can understand their position, where it comes from. Obviously, for them, it's kind of like cracking the platform that Iran and Turkey has been nurturing so skillfully, positioning themselves as the defenders of the Palestinian. They have an interest in the continuation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So obviously, they rejected and opposed the agreement. However, that was when you look today, for example, at the Turkish position, all of a sudden, the Turks are not so much against the agreement. The change of heart of Turkey has to do mostly with Turkey's inner economic crisis, its need to further boost its relationship with the United Arab Emirates, with Saudi Arabia. These are two major significant players that are enormously crucial for Turkey's economy. Also, Egypt is enormously significant in that sense for Turkey. So the change of heart of Turkey that now recently is not so much opposing the Abraham Accords, basically is reflection of course, cold, cynical political calculations, but also reflects the fact that, as I said before, the Palestinian issue is to a large extent a pawn, a card used by those players. Algeria, also another state where you have a strong Islamic voice. Algeria basically constantly present an objection to the whole story of the Abraham Accord. Lebanon, of course, that became an Iranian satellite, echoes the Iranian position. An interesting Arab state. It was interesting to see the reaction of some Arab states like Jordan, Kuwait, Tunisia, that basically took some sort of like an evasive position. In the case of Jordan, we understand it has to do with the whole story of the very complex Jordanian/Palestinian identity. The Jordanians are very concerned with any kind of an arrangement that could, in their mind, jeopardize the independence of Jordan. They don't want to be the one who will have to pay in the end of the day. In Kuwait, there is a very strong rejection to the whole idea of normalization with Israel in Kuwaiti politics. Tunisia, it's a very interesting example. The Tunisian president, Kais Saied, was elected. It was a big surprise. He, among other tickets he was running on, was the very strong anti-normalization, anti-Israel ticket. He expressed a very, very robust, strong position, condemning normalization and rejecting any kind of like idea of compromising with Israel. But surprisingly, following the signing of the Abraham Accords, Kais Saied was taking a very evasive position. He basically find an exit out of the dilemma by basically saying, well, the Abraham Accords and the normalizations and peace agreements signed are a sovereign decision and legitimate decision that any government can make. It's an inner affair, and Tunisia, of course, has no right to say something about it or to be involved in that. Obviously, the real thing here is that Tunisia is going through a major political and economic crisis. Once again, there is a lot of need in the open doors at the Gulf monarchies. And Kais Saied, that was the major reason why he changed his skin vis-a-vis this issue. And to conclude my presentation, well, will the Abraham Accord survive and perhaps expand? The Abraham Accord, as I was saying and explaining, is definitely an historic milestone. It's not a passing event. As I said, it didn't happen overnight. It's an event that was basically result of an accumulative process that I have described in my presentation. In other words, it's not something that is tactical. It's something that goes deeper than that. And I think that the normalization and peace agreements will provide one of the most significant frameworks to support the stabilizing alliances, those alliances that I mentioned before that are looking for stability because they need stabilities to be able to deal with both their inner domestic as well as regional challenges. The Abraham Accord reflects the changing landscape of the Middle East. It reflects the conjunction and conjoining of the long-term strategic interest of Israel and the Arab Gulf monarchies. This is one of the major reasons why I titled my recent book, my new one that was now published, the name of Inside the Middle East, Entering a New Era. Therefore, I see this alliance as stable and growing, and this is one of the predictions that I made in my book. That was the writing of the book was concluded back in November 2021. The book was published in February 2022, a couple of weeks ago, and already by now we could see that prediction stands the test of time. We just had the historic Negev Summit in Israel, which is yet another manifestation of that process. What should we expect down the road? Well, as part of my predictions, and I'm always making predictions as part of my work, I'm making predictions. It's very important for me to emphasize this point. I'm making predictions in my work, and I've made many predictions in articles that I wrote, in interviews, in the books that I write. I make a lot of predictions because in the end of the day, predictions are the only way for me to evaluate whether my analysis and reading of the reality is accurate. I have no other mechanism, and I cannot find shelter beyond concepts or theories. I must put my knowledge to the test of reality. That's the only way I can evaluate whether my reading of the reality is accurate. Obviously, it's a very challenging place to be emotionally and intellectually, psychologically, but I don't have any concessions on that issue, and I'm very glad and in order to say that up until now, overwhelmingly, I would say 95% of my predictions have been very accurate. Some of my predictions, I'm talking about predictions that I've made years in advance. So for me, as a professional expert, this is the predictions is very significant tool as part of my work. So I foresee that talking about the Abraham Accords, I foresee that Oman, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia will normalize their relation with Israel in this decade. They will either join the Abraham Accords or create an independence or joint agreements. Of all of the Arab Gulf monarchies, Kuwait is the most vocally opposed to the idea of normalization. Kuwait may therefore join, but only after Saudi Arabia. I also anticipated that in the same time period, two other Arab countries, Djibouti in West Africa and Cameroon in East Africa, will also formalize relation with Israel. There is some interesting kind of like long shot that I made in that context. I'm talking about an Arab country that is an intriguing candidate for establishing relations with Israel is Iraq. There are a number of factors that could, in due course, drive a process of establishing a connection between Baghdad and Jerusalem. However, it's not going to happen tomorrow morning. I do not expect any major developments towards a formal relationship in the foreseeable future. I just make a kind of like a notion to note that interesting story of Iraq, Israel, but this is something, as I said before, beyond the horizon line, is something that potentially could, at some point, could materialize, and that, of course, will be very interesting to watch if that will happen. And finally, in the preparing discussion to this session, I was also asked to say a few words about the story of Ukraine and the Middle East, a couple of immediate observations regarding the ramifications. First, it's interesting to see how all the players in the Middle East are actually walking between the raindrops vis-a-vis the crisis in Ukraine. None of them want to take decisively one side. Other, of course, Syria and Lebanon, who are basically an Iranian proxies, an Iranian satellite, who sided, Syria sided with Russia. Lebanon, it was interesting to see, while the Lebanese foreign minister condemned the Russian invasion to Ukraine, the Hezbollah obviously rushed to condemn the foreign minister for making this statement. Obviously, that reflects the fact that Hezbollah and the Iranians are the one that really controls and dictates Lebanese politics. But when you look at all the players in the region, you could see how they all kind of like walk between the raindrops. Obviously, Israel is a good example. Israel is very much engaged in the story of the Iranian presence in Syria, which creates a significant threat to the state of Israel. Israel identified the Iranian attempt to create a severe military threat from Syria on Israel in the shape of missiles and drones and maybe armed militias that will be present in the border between Israel and Syria, the ceasefire line, actually, to be more accurate. And Israel is determined to prevent that scenario. That's the reason Israel has been attacking hundreds of times Iranians and their proxies in Syria. And up until now, the Israeli attacks, the Russians in Syria are basically turning a blind eye to the Israeli attacks because it serves the Russians' interest. The Russians would like to restrict, if not to limit, the Iranian influence in Syria and to have the bigger cut, sort of speaking, of the Syrian cake. So as of now, the Russians are turning a blind eye to the Israeli attacks on the Iranians in Syria. And obviously, Israel has to take it into consideration vis-a-vis its position regarding the Ukrainian crisis. A very clear impact of the crisis is economically one. Obviously, the rise of price of gasoline worldwide is well known. Obviously, did not skip the Middle East. An interesting aspect is the story of the rise of prices of wheat and grains. Russia and Ukraine are huge suppliers of those commodities, and Arab countries, for example, Egypt, with 100 million people, are huge consumers of those commodities coming from Russia and Ukraine. There is a very significant concern that a continuation of the crisis in Ukraine will result in a rise in the price of bread, major commodities in the Arab world, and that would result in its turn, a growing discontent and unrest. In fact, governments in the Arab world expressed a deep concern with that scenario. Egyptian President Sisi, not so long ago, went to a one-day visit to Saudi Arabia, an urgent one. It was mostly centering around, among other things, the issue of the concern with the ramifications of the economic ramifications of the Ukraine war. Egypt apparently relies on Saudi support financially to be able to cross that crisis, hoping that the crisis will be over as soon as possible. Another interesting impact, which is not so clear, of the war in Ukraine is in the trajectory of the story of the talks with Iran over the Iranians' nuclear program. And here is an interesting development. Russia, at some point, all of a sudden, expressed reservations with the agreement, and Russia actually conditioned its willingness to sign the agreement. Russia is part of the 5+1 negotiating with Iran. Russia conditioned its willingness to sign the agreement with the commitment of the West a written commitment of the West, that the Russia would not be sanctions for any deals it will make with Iran, including military deals. That Russian, out of the blue, sort of speaking, demand was surprised and in fact bitterly surprised the Iranians, because the Iranians were ready and willing to sign an agreement. But actually what happened was that at least at this point, Russia was kind of like taking the Iranian negotiation, the Vienna negotiation, as a hostage to counter the crumbling sanctions that the West inflicted upon Russia because of the invasion to the Ukraine. So this is an interesting, less expected, sort of speaking, ramification or immediate impact of the story of the war in Ukraine in the context of the negotiation with Iran. Another, I would say, immediate ramification, the war in Ukraine boosts tendency of US allies in the region to develop and enhance their own self-defense and deterrence capabilities. Once again, we had a couple of recent example to that. The Negev Summit is one example. The Sharm el-Sheikh Summit that took a couple of days before that. Another summit that took place within the leaders of Jordan, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and Iraq, basically are all centered around the whole notion, growing notion among particularly allies of the United States in the region that are putting a big question mark to what extent they can really rely on the United States in times of need. And one of the conclusions they are coming to is that they have to be able to develop and enhance their self-defense capacities and capabilities. That has a couple of ramifications. For example, it's the war further boosts the arms race in the Middle East. I mean, it's very clear today, and particularly in the last, following the last events, the recent attacks of Iranian proxies, the Houthis on the Saudi oil facilities, further boost that understanding with the growing tendency of the United States to depart the region. The major players in the region reached to the conclusion they must develop a significant military deterrence capacities. Egypt has been building a huge military capacity. The Saudis, United Arab Emirates, Israel, it's all very clear that they have to further develop those capacities. The war in Ukraine furthers and the ramifications further strengthen the foundations of the alliance of moderation, again, as a need to basically be able to stand independently in face of whatever challenge may come tomorrow, particularly when you look at the tendency of the United States to exit the region and the growing impact and influence of the Iranians. And talking about the Iranians today, when you look, and I'm looking at, of course, at the discussion across the region in the Arab world, talking to people, reading articles and listening to commentators and Arab commentators and others, I would say there is a very clear sentiment or notion which is kind of like currently under a question mark, though this question mark is more and more fading and becoming a straight answer. Will the West reevaluate its tolerance policy towards Iran's threats? I think that I would not be wrong if I would say at this point the tendency across the region is more to assume that the appeasing tolerant policy of the West towards the Iranians is going to continue, if not to increase. And as you could understand, there is a lot of discontent and frustration and anxiety among players in the region. Though that anxiety was clearly manifested by the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates in a couple of recent events. Israel is more polite in that sense, but Israel definitely is deeply concerned with that scenario. And Israel conveyed messages to the Biden administration, even though less bluntly conveyed in comparison to the way that the Saudis and the Emirates basically were doing that recently. So these are kind of like immediate observations regarding both the current and potentially long-term ramification of the war in Ukraine in the context of the Middle East. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, I conclude my presentation and I'm opening this session to your questions.
Thank you so much. I think you've been very clear. Already some questions are coming. So let me check that on Facebook and both in the Q&A on this webinar. Thank you so much for your questions already. Let me group them a little bit. Firstly, can you reflect on the Negev Summit for a bit? You called them historic. Why? And was the summit more than you could hope for, or was it exactly what you predicted as well?
Well, as I said in my presentation, the Negev Summit is a straight or direct and natural continuation to the whole story of the Alliance of Moderation, the story of the Abraham Accords. And again, when you look at the summit for itself, I mean, here is a summit where Israel is hosting major Arab leaders in Israel that are coming to Israel openly and actually in front of TV screens and media and stuff like that, and actually are making a very clear stand position together. This is the first time actually where such a very frontal appearance has been done. I mean, this is for itself very unique. Not less unique is the fact that when you look at the reactions in the Arab world, at least on those places that are part of that, the reactions are very positive, largely speaking. Of course, there are also expressions of discontent, but largely speaking, the Negev Summit, and again, it goes back to what I said before, the Negev Summit is well received in those places in the Arab world and others because it is received in the right context, meaning it's basically a summit that stands to further serve the interests of those countries, the long-term interest. So
people actually understand that.
People understand it. People understand it. I mean, I'm looking at the social media, for example. It's amazing to see notes in Saudi social media, in the United Arab Emirates and others that are basically echoing this whole idea that says, this is our interest. We are doing service to ourselves. And again, there are other voices. It has to be mentioned. There are other voices also in Saudi Arabia or in the United Arab Emirates. There are voices who oppose the whole idea of the normalization. I have to be clear about it. It's not totally rosy and pinky, but just the same, there is an understanding that it serves interest. I don't know to say what exactly were the expectations, but when you look at beyond the formal aspect, which for itself is very significant of the summit, when you look at the concluding statement, the fact that there has been concluding statement where all leaders are standing in front line and actually expressing this consensus, it's very clear they are talking about what their needs are and why do they come together. So the issue of the Iranian threat is there, and the issue of the militant Islamist groups is there, and the issue of stability, the needing stability is there. And these are all real things. These are not cosmetic things. And this is significant. That's why it's significant to understand it. Again, the summit for itself is yet another significant milestone, but it's basically a direct, natural continuation of the Abraham Accords and the normalization agreements, because it's being fed by the very same elements that resulted in the Abraham Accord and the Alliance of Moderation.
Can you maybe go back to one of the three maps you presented? Because I'm hoping that some questions will arise about these maps as well. In the meantime, I'll ask another question. Will the Iranian corridor expand in the near future? Where and when?
Well, the Iranian corridor is a big question mark. Let me try to, if you can make me if I could share the map with you again. I cannot share it. If you can, I'm not sure if you could see it.
No, we can see it now, but
you cannot see it now. I think that I'm not longer a host. If you can make me a host, I maybe try to show it again.
No, I cannot make you host. Sorry.
You cannot.
Doesn't matter. Look, we have the map in our heads.
You have the. So when I'm talking about the Iranian land corridor, here's the situation. As I mentioned before, look, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq have one major common denominator today, and they are fighting for their independence, and because they are all struggling the Iranian grip. Lebanon is an Iranian satellite, as I mentioned before. Syria is partly occupied by the Iranians. In Iraq, there is a significant Iranian influence. As I mentioned before, when I was talking about the land corridor that Iran was trying to establish, I said in Lebanon, Iran basically has an open, free, non-controlled access. The Hezbollah controls the gates. Iranians are coming in and out, whatever they want to do. Basically, it's their own domain, so to speak. In Syria, the Iranians are trying to establish this land corridor, and they are putting a lot of effort in the eastern part of Syria that borders Iraq. However, a very crucial component for establishing this connection between Iraq and Syria is whether the Iranian-backed Iraqi Shiite militias will be able to secure this passage for the Iranians from Iraq to Syria. And here, the Iranians are facing two or couple of major challenges that basically presents an obstacle to that vision. One is that in the eastern part of Syria, the Kurds in the northeast part of Syria, massively backed by the US, the US that has a presence in the triangle of borders, Jordan, not so far from Jordan, Israel, and Syria, are basically presenting a tangible obstacle on the path of such an Iranian land corridor. There has been reports also that Israel has been attacking compound and convoys, Iranian convoys in the eastern part of Syria. So this is one aspect of the challenge. The other side of the challenge, Iraqi side, and that is because right now in Iraq there is, and again it goes back to the story of the Iranian struggle to get free of the Iranian grip, of the Iraqi struggle to get free of the Iranian grip. Iraq is going through a major turbulences, and one of the major things that is there is a power struggle between Iraqi nationalists on the one hand and the Iranian affiliated Iraqi Shiite camp. There is a major power struggle within the Shiites in Iraq, which the Shiites in Iraq are the biggest group. And in course of time, it seems more and more that the hands of the Iraqi nationalists, they have the upper hand. Because the major sentiment that comes out from the Iraqi Shiites to Iran says Iraq is an Arab state. Iraq is an independent and should be part of the Arab state, and we want you, Iran, to be out. And there is a growing friction and power struggle within Iraq in that context. So in the sense of, or in the context of the story of the Iranian land corridor, the Iraqi government, also under US pressure, but also as part of the inner Iraqi power struggle, the Iraqi government actually took control over the passages between Iraq and Syria. So basically they restrict in a way the abilities of the Iranian-backed Iraqi Shiite militias to form this open straight line that connects Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. So for the time being, and in my prediction, the Iranian will not be able to create the same exact level of control over the Syrian and the Iraqi part of the land corridor the way they have in Lebanon.
So the corridor is rather declining.
The corridor is facing challenges. I wouldn't say currently declining, but it's facing challenges.
Or rather declining than being stronger or expanding.
Well, again, look, I mean, when I'm trying to assess, I'm quite skeptic about Lebanon's capacity or ability to get free of the Iranian grip. I don't see that happening, at least not in the foreseeable future. Syria and Iraq is a little bit different story. In Syria, potentially could be a situation where Iranian presence in Syria has limit, to start with, has some sort of limitation. It's possible that as part of the willingness of Arab states to take back Assad regime and to rehabilitate Assad regime, one of the things will be, obviously the Arab would expect Assad to kick the Iranians out of Syria. And maybe there will be a time, because we have to remember, Iran is in Syria because the Iranian says, we are in Syria because Assad invited us to come to Syria. The same way Assad invited them to come to Syria, he could also ask them politely to leave Syria. Then that will be something challenging for the Iranians. They are
as polite as he is.
As polite as he is. And in Iraq, as I said before, there is this power struggle between Iraqi nationalists on the one hand and the Iranian affiliated one, and it seems like the Iraqi nationalists are having the upper hand. So I'm skeptic about Lebanon. I'm question mark about Syria, and question mark yet more optimistic, relatively speaking, about Iraq's ability to get free of the Iranian grip. And of course, what happened in this land corridor, this development that happens between Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, the way to the Mediterranean, will have an enormous ramifications on the geostrategic landscape of the region.
Yeah, I'm getting some thumbs up from the person who asked the question, so thank you. Do we focus too much on the land corridor and what's happening on the ground, and should we focus more on what's happening on the sea surrounding the Arab Peninsula, you think?
No. As I mentioned before, as I was talking about the 5 arenas of friction, you may remember 4 out of the 5 are seas, are maritimes, and definitely those maritime arenas, the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandab Strait, the Arab/Persian Gulf, those are enormously crucial in the context of this current and future geostrategic landscape of the Middle East. And as I mentioned very clearly, when I was talking about those 4 arenas, we are looking at arenas that have become stages of growing frictions and instability. I mean, you got ships that are being attacked in the Gulf. You got mines that are scattered in the Bab el-Mandab Strait. You got ships that are being attacked in the Red Sea. You got a lot of tensions in the eastern basin of the Mediterranean. So each and every one of those arenas, this maritime arena, is enormously significant. They are altogether obviously very significant, and each and every one of them became today, in the coming couple of years, a growing stage for a growing friction, tensions, and instability.
One of the countries that is on that side is Qatar. The person who is asking the question, Rishi, is asking, is Qatar a sidekick of Iran? It was not on the map.
Yeah, well, Qatar and Iran has a good relationship. They share some huge oil gas fields. And the Qataris obviously have no intention to damage the relations with the Iranians. In fact, as there will be growing need to define a new game rules between the Arab Gulf monarchies and Iran, Qatar obviously plans and probably will be a major player in that context. The Qataris have an open door in Iran. That enables Qatar to be kind of like a go-between, a mediator in the discussion. Oman also plays, but to a lesser extent, role in that sense. So Qatar is definitely, as I said before, maybe I did not say, or maybe I should say it, the Arab Gulf monarchies are saying to the Iranians, they're saying, look, we want to have a good relationship with you. We are neighbors, okay? We just want you to stay off our business. and we could have a good relationship. The Iranian regime, obviously, the Mullah regime has a different thoughts on that issue. But definitely, Qatar is a very significant player, and Qatar is going to trying to monetize that card more to further establish Qatar's role as a leading factor in the region.
And whitewashing its own position in the next summer. I got two questions and 4 minutes, so let's see how far we can go. Firstly, will the alliance of moderation be strong enough to really compete with Iran and Turkey? Albert is asking.
The answer is yes. I mean, look, Turkey. As I said before, Turkey today is less of a threat because, as I mentioned before, Turkey is going through lots of challenges economically, politically. Those challenges, as well as other developments, basically force Erdogan to adopt a much more smiling policy towards the Gulf monarchies, towards Israel. In the context of Iran, look, in the end of the day, the Iranian model of expansion has a strong side that serves the Iranians, but at the same time, it has an Achilles heel. The strong side of the model of the expansion of the Iranian is that they are using proxies. They are not the one who are squeezing the trigger. Others are squeezing the triggers. Obviously, the weapons and the missiles and the drones and the military know-how comes from the Iranians. But it's not the Iranians who squeeze the trigger. It's their proxies. So in that sense, Iran basically is immune from ramification. So it's the Houthis who are launching missiles and drones in Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. It's the Hezbollah or Hamas or Islamic Jihad that basically launch rockets or missiles at Israel. It's not Iran. So Iran is just supplying them with the weapons and the missiles. It's not
so
Iran.
What is the Achilles heel? The
Achilles heel is that relying on those domestic proxies that are basically, in the end of the day, part of a surrounding environment is very limited. Because, for example, if you look at Lebanon, Hezbollah, with all its might, and it presents a very serious, severe threat to the state of Israel, Hezbollah is not operating in a vacuum. It's part of a place called Lebanon. It has to be tuned to the other players involved. The same applies for Hamas in Gaza Strip and Islamic Jihad in Gaza Strip. The same applies for Houthis in Yemen. In other words, when you are trying to use proxies that are located elsewhere and are part of this elsewhere environment, you have to take into consideration that in the end of the day, those proxies not necessarily will be 100% blind servant of your needs. They have to take into consideration their own domestic calculation. So this is in a way sort of like an Achilles heel of the Iranian, master plan, or sort of speaking model of expansion. Now, going back to the issue of the alliance, look, we are looking at major countries in the region: Israel, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt. These are countries that have a very serious military capacities that could cause the Iranians and their proxies a very severe damage. The Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Iranians know that if the Hezbollah is going to be engaged in a war with Israel, that may result in a fatal outcome for the Hezbollah. One could expect that in such scenario, the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates would be more than happy to provide Israel with an open checks, sort of speaking, of weapons and ammunition to make sure that the Hezbollah is going to be eliminated. So these are part of the calculations that I think players in the region are taking. The alliance of moderation and major partners of that have a significant military intelligence technological capacities, and the Iranians are aware of that.
Right. So the strength of Iran is its weakness as well, in the form of the proxies. Last question. Do you see the development in the Arab countries to overcome their domestic challenges, like getting 21st century skills, find new sources of income, and reduce unemployment? Do you see that happening?
Yes, I do actually. I mean, one of the things that I'm writing in my new book is, again, going back to the reason why I titled this book, Entering a New Era, is one of the things that I identify, I think, is that in the midst of this big chaos in the Arab world and the failure of the national statehood, I do identify an interesting, I would say, seeds for potentially evolving a new kind of a statehood model that is more successful in comparison to the one of the 20th century. I identified that process in Morocco, in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Sudan, Jordan, Kuwait. These are places where I look closely and I notice there is this, those places are going in the midst of the political turbulences, economic challenges, and other things that they are dealing with. I notice an interesting dialogue that is forming between three major factors. One is the civil society camp that actually further centers the idea of an independent national statehood as a functioning one, as it's one of its core ideology. The government and the rulers in the region are more and more aware of the fact that there is a need for a new pact with the people. I mean, the Moroccan king, Mohammed VI, made it very clear. He said, we, the governments, the rulers of the Arab world, we need to have a new pact with the people that centers around the issue of like civic responsibility, but also governmental accountability and responsibility, which is also for itself a positive sign. And then there is another interesting development, which is again relatively new. And this is that there is a major camp that has always been part of this whole discussion regarding the issue of statehood. And this is the Islamic camp, and particularly the most politically affiliated Islamic camp, which is the Muslim Brotherhood. And the interesting development is that the Muslim Brotherhood is experiencing a deep ideological and political crisis in the last decade, particularly. And that crisis resulted in a split, in some places, a formal split within the Muslim Brotherhood, like in Jordan, Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt. And at the core of this split is the rise of a dogmatic, pragmatic camp within Muslim Brotherhood that has today the upper hand in comparison to the dogmatic, ideologically core motivated camp within Muslim Brotherhood. So the pragmatic camp within Muslim Brotherhood is basically today conveying a very interesting political message. And the interesting political message it conveys is that the pragmatic camp within political Islam, and namely mostly Muslim Brotherhood, which is a very significant political player, the pragmatic camp is willing to actually work together with other camps, like civil society camps, for example, for the sake of creating a more successful, a more solid, a more stable national statehood model. This is very interesting because one of the core ideology of political Islam, and particularly Muslim Brotherhood, is the total rejection of the idea of national statehood. But today we see that with the appearance or emergence of this pragmatic camp that has the upper hand within political Islam, we see this shift, which is very interesting. We see that in Morocco, we see that in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Jordan, in Sudan, in Egypt.
Interesting and hopeful, I think.
And that's the reason I think this is potentially a positive, it's positive seeds. It's an early phase. It has to be clear that first, there is no guarantee it's going to materialize. And second, what can be guaranteed that is going to be continuing a turbulence process. But at least the fact that at least I can identify that process, I think for itself gives some sort of a hope that maybe we will witness sometime during the deep into the 21st century, the emergence of a more successful national statehood model in the Arab world.
Let's speak to each other next year and see how the pawns in the Middle East have changed. Thank you so much for now, Mr. Avi Melamed. To wrap it up, I've learned a lot about Turkey's position in the Middle East and also in Africa. Sometimes we forget about Africa, but it's also explained Turkey's reaction to the Abraham Accords, and that it's also geopolitical and a selfish position to play the Palestinian card, as you mentioned, and that it can also be very good for the moderate Palestinians to support the Abraham Accords. Thank you for those insights. I hope you as listeners learn that and more too. This is the final and last webinar. But one final note, this webinar series was made possible by our generous donors. Please consider becoming a friend of CIDI. Go to cidi.nl to see what's possible. Thanks for listening and sharing. Bye.
Thank you, and shalom from Israel.
Shalom.
Bye-bye. Shalom, shalom.